Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a new book by Ada Ferrer entitled Cuba and American History, published by Scribner last September. And joining us this afternoon are two discussants, Rebecca Scott of the University of Michigan and Lillian Guerrera of the University of Florida. I'm Eric Arneson from George Washington University, the co-chair of the Washington History Seminar, along with my colleague, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, its History and Public Policy program, and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times in person at the Wilson Center, and since the pandemic, here in the virtual realm. For those of you who like to plan ahead, we have some 16 additional sessions on our calendar running through late May. Behind the scenes, there are two people who make these sessions possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. We'd like to thank the institutional supporters, particularly the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous donors. As we say every week, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and will soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function, not chat, but raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. And to those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I turn over the screen to Christian Osterman, who will be moderating today's session. Christian, welcome.
Thanks, Eric, and a warm welcome from me as well to the Washington History Seminar. I'm really excited about this afternoon's all-star cast and can't wait to get going with this panel. Let me preface, though, by saying that this afternoon's seminar is co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Latin American program. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Ada Ferrer, who is the Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she's taught since 1995. She's the author of Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1890, winner of the Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by women in any field of history, and Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, which won the Frederick Douglass Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, as well as multiple prizes from the American Historical Association. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, she has been traveling to and conducting research on the island since 1990. Today, she will talk about her new book, Cuba and American History. Ada, the Zoom room is all yours. Welcome to the Washington History.
Well, thank you, Kristen and Eric, for hosting me, and to all of you for coming to listen to this session, and to Rebecca Scott and Lillian Guerra, both good friends and esteemed colleagues. So I'm grateful to have their input and their take and their questions on the book. So I'm here today to talk about this new book, which, as you heard, came out in September. It's called Cuba and American History, and the book, in its most simply put, is a history of Cuba from the arrival of Columbus, or a little before, to the present. It's not a textbook built around high political history or abstract structural analysis, nor is it an academic monograph for specialists. It does not explicitly engage historiographical debates, though it draws heavily on the rich and path-breaking work of colleagues in the field who've produced those monographs, including, of course, the two we have, my two interlocutors here today, Rebecca and Lillian. Despite my own personal relationship with the history that the book tells, and despite the fact that it works in some family history into the narrative, the book is emphatically not a memoir. It is a history of Cuba. And I see it as it's a character and episode-driven history of the island, narrated over more than 500 years, that I see as reconceived and re-narrated or written for this particular moment, when it feels like history itself sometimes seems up for grabs. So in recent years, since the passing of Fidel Castro from this world, of Raul Castro from power, both those things raised urgent questions about the island's political future. And they invite new historical analysis of the meanings and legacies of the Cuban Revolution. In the US, Barack Obama's opening to Cuba, followed by Trump's closing, and then by Biden's so far strange inaction, have made the nature of the historic relationship between the two countries a subject of reinterpretation once more. Then in Cuba itself, the protests of November 2020, the much more dramatic events of this past summer, and the persecution of protesters that has unfolded since, demand a reckoning with history, a reckoning with Cuba's past, as well as a reckoning with the relationship between the two countries. So what I want to talk about today is how the book tries to engage in that kind of reckoning, both in its framing and in its writing. So I'm going to begin first by talking a little bit about how I try to grapple with the complex dynamic between Cuba in the U.S. Okay, how I try to grapple with it in a very, I mean that at a granular kind of level in the actual writing and narrating of the book. And what I do is I often try to play with readers' perspectives and expectations right from the start of each chapter. So, but my point is not just to surprise the reader for the sake of surprise, but rather to draw their attention to things that don't fit easy categories, to things at the edge of the frame. So the chapter openings often encompass things that are both familiar and unfamiliar to the reader in order to create a kind of space of welcome, but also a space of slight discomfort. More than that, I want the book to function also as a kind of selective, necessarily incomplete history of the United States, but reimagined from Cuban ground and Cuban waters. Sometimes I refer to the project as a kind of shadow history of the U.S. In the first instance, it prompts American readers to think anew about Cuba. In the second, it invites readers to think anew and maybe also slightly askew about the U.S. itself. Ultimately, then, I think of the book as a history of Cuba that gives American readers a view of their own country through the eyes of another. And that's what the book tries to do in terms of U.S. history from the start. And in terms of how I do that concretely, I'm going to give you a few examples from the book about the way I start. And I picked 3 chapters that I thought illustrated this well. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I start each of those chapters in this way that I'm suggesting. So chapter 1 begins with the arrival of Columbus in the New World in 1492. And of course, that history is one that's very, very familiar to American readers. It's part of, U.S., social studies from second grade on, right? It's a part of almost every history of the U.S. written since the early 19th century. So while I begin that chapter with that very familiar story, I preface it with a very simple observation, a very obvious observation, and that is that Columbus never set foot in any territory that became part of the United States. And then that simple observation raises a question. Why is it that a history that did not occur in the US or in the territories that became the US eventually why is it that story came to serve as the obligatory origin point of US history? And I go on to show that conception of US history beginning in 1492 actually has its origin in the 19th century in the hands of in many cases, historians who were also American statesmen, and that they developed that idea precisely as the US was imagining expanding into once Spanish territories. So basically what they did is seize an essentially foreign history and make it their own, many of them fully expecting that the lands on which that history unfolded would soon be theirs too, right? So so I use that story. It's familiar, but I use it and narrate it in a way that calls attention to something that will be less familiar, perhaps to American readers, which is that it calls unexpected attention to Americans to the place of empire in American history from an early point, and it calls unexpected attention to Americans' understanding of their own history. Okay, then I want to jump a few centuries, actually, and go to a chapter that's about the 19th century and slavery. And it's one of my favorite chapters. It begins with the inauguration of U.S. Vice President Franklin Pierce. And I narrate the strange inauguration, which was often called, for a long time, was called the worst inauguration in U.S. history. And one of the things that's striking about it is the vice president, William Rufus King, was missing from the inauguration. It turns out that that Vice President King was actually in Cuba on a Cuban sugar plantation, and which is where he took his oath of office, from the highest point on the plantation, overlooking the fields where enslaved men and women were bending over sugarcane. He had tuberculosis and was taking something called the sugar cure, which meant that his doctor recommended it, and he was meant to sit in the mill, in the house, where in the structure where the sugar machinery was, and breathe in all the fumes and heat, and that was supposed to cure his tuberculosis. It didn't. But by starting he died. But by starting the chapter that way, right, starting a chapter on Cuban slavery with an American vice presidential inauguration, I'm able to implicate the U.S. in a history of Cuban slavery in a way that readers will be surprised by and will, I hope, remember. So it's just another example of how I'm narrating Cuban history, stressing the role of the U.S., but narrating it in a way that causes Americans to also think differently about U.S. history itself, not just differently about Cuba. And then finally, I want to give an example from the much more recent, jump another century to the Cuban Revolution. And I think of all the Cuban Revolution of 1959, I think of all the histories that I narrate in this book, the period on the revolution is the part that I think many U.S. readers assume that they're most familiar with. So I felt the burden keenly in that last third or so of the book to shift some of their default perspectives and to disrupt their expectations in productive ways. And this, I think it was true for the whole section on the revolution, but I think those parts of the revolutions that American readers have some knowledge of, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Bay of Pigs, are important chapters where it's absolutely essential to do that. So I want to just chat briefly about the chapter on the Bay of Pigs. And how I decided to start that narration. The most common accounts of that event often begin in Cuba with the landing of the U.S. orchestrated invasion of anti-Castro exiles in the swamp at the Bay of Pigs. When I tell that story, I begin it in the swamp as well, on Cuban territory, but I begin it differently. So I place the reader in the swamp, but I go back eons really and talk about the landscape that the landscape of the place, going back actually, very, very briefly, right? Because to the era of dinosaurs, actually. And I talk about species that have lived in that area that have changed so little that scientists refer to them as living fossils. One of those is a species called the queen triggerfish, which in Cuba was called cochinos, which is how the bay got its name. But anyway, I narrate that just in a paragraph, and then I put people in the landscape. And the people are latecomers to the landscape. So I talk about indigenous people, even before Columbus, burying their dead, feet always facing to the east, about captive Africans who would have been marched across the Coral to plantations as part of the illegal slave trade, including probably some of the people who were processing and making sugar in the presence of the American vice president. In the period, I talk about generations of coal workers who make their living there. After the revolution, I talk about early government projects there, and the fact that Fidel Castro spent his first Christmas in power having dinner with coal workers in the area. He showed up uninvited with a pig and a half and sat down and did Noche Buena dinner with them. So the chapter then goes on to narrate the failure of the invasion that Americans know as the Bay of Pigs. But by beginning in the swamp with Cuban geography and Cuban history, with actual residents of the area, and including their experiences in the first 2 years of the revolution, I remind readers that any discussion of the failure of that invasion has to encompass that history. Any history of U.S.-Cuban relations has to grapple with Cuba's deep past, with the history of Cuba itself. No landing or invasion ever occurs on a blank slate, or more literally, an empty beach. History cannot be willed away. And so that's a little bit of how I do the back and forth, trying to, trouble our ideas about U.S.-Cuban relations. But I want to note that if speaking about the Bay of Pigs, if American military planners could not will away history, it is also true that no Cuban can will away history either. So I want to shift gears in this last part of the talk and address the question of how I see the book addressing not just American readers, but also Cuban and Cuban American readers. How does the book speak to them? How does the book reconceive Cuban history, not just Cuban US history? So I would say that, first of all, I wanted to provide a new kind of synthesis, a new kind of, I wanted a synthesis that was synthetic, but didn't always feel like a synthesis, page to page. So it's a history of Cuba, as I said, over more than 5 centuries. So on one level, it's a kind of epic, sweeping history, full of larger than life figures like Columbus and Castro and Martí and Maceo and many, 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 many others. But at the same time, I was very conscious that I wanted to put other people in the narrative, to put figures like those larger than life figures alongside others who in many cases we don't even know the names of, right? The people whose lives are buffeted by big H history, but that are often not accorded space in synthetic big histories. People like the enslaved men and women on an American-owned plantation, and a plantation owned by an American senator, actually, who used to do things at night in the huts on their plantation to the light of glowworms, which served them as candles. I wanted to make room for people, much, much later, say, launching a raft from the Malecón in the 1990s, or going to the Malecón to see others off. Even when I can't know who those people were or what they were thinking and feeling, I placed them in the narrative to make sure that readers know that this is their history too. It is a narrative, I hope, in which ordinary people might recognize themselves and recognize each other. So if it's epic history in the way my editor wanted it to be, I also wanted to be epic history on a very human scale. And I think that human scale does something else as well. I hope that it helps us resist the urge to tell history from the perspective of hindsight. Some of that is inevitable. After all, as we write, as we read, we often know what is coming next, right? What comes after the events we're describing and analyzing. But I try to construct a contingent account to narrate it as much as possible in a way that forestalls the outcome, in a way that comes closer to capturing the experience of people living through history day to day. And I think this was especially important for the parts of the book that deal with the post-1952, and perhaps especially for the post-1959 era. One of the other things I did in writing about the revolution to trouble particularly Cuban expectations was to never use the phrase triumph of the revolution. That is a standard way that the revolution speaks about itself. It's a standard phrase in Cuban scholarship, in journalism, even in everyday life. But I believe that to say that the revolution triumphed in 1959 assumes that the revolution was already fully formed, that it was a singular entity already defined. And that formulation ignores all the deep-seated conflicts that unfolded after Batista fled, all the deep-seated conflicts that would end up giving meaning to what happened after 1959 and after 61. So throughout, I try to restore that sense of uncertainty, disrupting frames that assume that we can speak of 62 years of anything. For the government in Havana, it is 62 years of revolution, of struggle, of resistance. For the government's opponents, it might be 62 years of dictatorship. Both perspectives, I think, can be profoundly ahistorical, ignoring the fact that time never stands still, that Cuba in 1959 is not the same thing as in 1980 or 1995 or 2016 or 2022. In the end, by writing this history, as human, contingent, sometimes surprising, sometimes heartbreaking, I think what I'm really trying to do in the only way that I know how is to try to imagine a future that is built on a foundation of mutual recognition. So to close, I think if the book invites American readers to see their own country, the US, from the eyes of another, I think it urges Cuban readers to see their own past through the eyes of each other. And that's what I was trying to do with the book. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Before I introduce our two wonderful commentators, let me remind our audience that there are three ways for you to participate in this discussion this afternoon, and we encourage you to do so. You can do so by using the raise hand function, and you'll be queued, and we will call on you to unmute yourself and to pose your question to the panelists. You can also post your question in the Q&A function in Zoom. Please do not, as Eric mentioned, use the chat function. And if you're following us on Facebook Live, feel free to email Rachel Wheatley at rwheatley@historians.org. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our two commentators this afternoon. They will kind of launch us into a conversation, into a discussion with Dr. Ferrer, and a discussion that we hope will include many of you in the audience as well. Our first commentator is Professor Rebecca Scott. She is the Charles Gibson Distinguished University Professor of History and Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. Trained at Princeton and at the London School of Economics, she studies the dynamics of slave emancipation and the emergence of citizenship, both in Cuba and the United States. With Jean Hebrard, she's the co-author of Freedom Papers, An Atlantic Odyssey in the Age of Emancipation, published by Harvard in 2012. Several of her articles focus on women challenging their enslavement or asserting their rights as citizens, including Maria Coletta and the Capuchin Friar, Slavery, Salvation, and the Adjudication of Status, published in William and Mary Quarterly in 2019, and Reclaiming Gregoria's Mule, published in Past and Present in 2001. Then we'll go to Professor Lillian Guerra. She is Professor of History of Cuba and the Caribbean in the Department of History at the University of Florida. She's the author of 5 books of history, among them Visions of Power in Cuba, Revolution, Redemption, and Resistance, 1959 to 1971, published by Chapel Hill, University of Chapel Hill Press in 2012. Heroes, Martyrs, and Political Messiahs in Revolutionary Cuba, 1946 to 1958, published by Yale in 2018. And most recently, Patriots and Traitors in Revolutionary Cuba, 1961 to 1981 with University of Pittsburgh Press. She began researching Cuba in 1969 when she lived and worked there for an uninterrupted year. She has received a number of prestigious fellowships in the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her book, Visions of Power in Cuba, won the Latin American Studies Association Bryce Wood Book Award for the best book in 2014 across all fields. So we'll first go to Dr. Scott and then to Dr. Guerra. Dr. Scott, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. So it's a real pleasure to participate in this discussion. And Cuba, An American History, is a truly exceptional book. It's one that can be read in many ways. I can testify that a reader can curl up with it on a cold winter morning in Michigan as they would with a novel and pretty much lose themselves in the narrative following the people and the stories that you introduce so vividly. Or if the reader is a historian, they can step back and marvel at how you've done it, how you've conveyed such a measured and sophisticated historical analysis through these stories. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions for the discussion to Professor Ferrer. And my first question has to do with empire. So I'm very struck by the way in which you make the concept of empire so accessible to readers. It's, of course, a concept that Cubans and US-based historians of Cuba, including Luis A. Perez and Lars Schultz and many others, have been using for decades to describe the relationship between the United States and Cuba. And you use these multiple points of often quite astonishing convergences from the vice presidential inauguration that you mentioned to many others to insist that the histories of these two countries are inextricably entwined. And you point out that again and again, members of US administrations evoked what they saw as a debt of gratitude that they imagined that Cubans should show to the United States, tracing back to the Cuban Wars of Independence and the US intervention in those wars. And of course, that's in terms of rhetoric, in terms of ideology, it's a classic imperial move to ask that the objects of the empire's attention should express gratitude. And this continued, was a characteristic of the early 20th century, and I recall it continuing well into the first Bush administration, with various statements being made about the way in which Cuba had obtained independence notionally through US intervention, which often required quite a sleight of hand. You'd sometimes read that Cuba had acquired its independence in 1899, and other times US press would somehow date it to 1902 or 1901. And the blurring of those dates, I think, was emblematic of a failure to really comprehend what the sequence had been. And you note that upon arriving in Cuba, President Barack Obama finally really broke with that narrative. He spoke of a shared identity as peoples of the Americas in the plural, picking up on language used by Martí and many others. And even though his policies were abruptly overturned by his successor, it occurs to me, and I'd be curious to know whether it seems this way to you as well, that the language of obligatory gratitude based on events in 1898 may have finally reached a point of a kind of exhaustion. And it may be that the invoking of US intervention in that war has finally expired, at least on the part of the United States. So one interesting question is, what kind of language is going to replace it? What other frames are going to be used in which the relationship of the United States to Cuba is going to be described? And so here's one thought about that. I think that with the explosion of platforms and media sources, it may be possible to persuade people in the United States, perhaps, to listen more and maybe talk a bit less. I recalled that as what I thought was the title of a song from the musical Hamilton, but turns out, no, the musical Hamilton, it's talk less, smile more. But I think we can easily angle it to talk less, listen more. And so it's really quite possible for people in the United States, whether they have a little bit of Spanish or a lot of Spanish or mostly English, it's possible now for them to be picking up news of events that are happening in Cuba from multiple sources. It doesn't have to be mediated through presidential or congressional statements. For example, if a reader with some Spanish looks at the blog by the Cuban legal and political thinker Julio César Guanche, that blog, which is called simply La Cosa, as in ¿Cómo está la cosa?, which is sort of how are things going, they can see essays and interviews and photographs. And they can also see that on the front page of that blog, there are three terms: democracy, socialism, and republic. And those terms, I think, cut right across the usual language from the leadership in both countries, in which United States presidents and Congress members try to monopolize the word democracy, and the Cuban leadership grabs hold of the word socialism. And neither one usually the word republic seems to float kind of out of reach. It may get short shrift, partly because it would raise questions of empire and sovereignty. In what sense is a republic truly a republic if it's held within an empire? In Cuba, it may not be used because it evokes the 1940 Constitution, which has somehow gone from being an ideal at the moment of 1959 to being something associated with counter-revolutionary thought. So if a US reader starts looking around amidst Twitter feeds and blogs coming from Cuba and from Cubans, maybe they'll begin to get a sense of different ways that different language can be put together into a political program. So reading your book brings, I think, almost any observer or scholar of Cuba back to that painful realization that the will and the desire of the legislative and the executive branches of the United States government seems to keep coming back to an impulse to control, to devise in Washington or Miami a governmental future for Cuba. And this, despite the very clear evidence in your book, as in other books, that such intervention is almost invariably utterly counterproductive to what is meant to be the long-term project of democratization. So here would be the question part. What are the ways in which you think your narrative, which makes the idea of empire so accessible, because it isn't surrounded by a great deal of ideological noise and a whole lot of statements of indignation and judgment, can a more reasoned understanding, a more clear-eyed understanding that it is not an ideological statement to say that the United States behaved in an imperial fashion, could that maybe enable people to acknowledge what I think is your goal, which is respectful and reciprocal ties between people resident in each country and their leaders to help the cause of democracy on both sides of the Florida Straits? Then my last questions, which are sort of two questions in one, come from our shared experience as researchers and writers, and they're very closely connected. And I think in this book, you have found through archival and library research and memories of conversations to take what might in another writer's hands look like simply an anecdote or a vignette, and instead you turn it into something that is analytically very telling and also memorable. You find a way to make your story carry the analysis along with these individual stories. And you do this, remarkably enough, right across the pre-colonial, colonial period through the tumult of the 19th century on into the present. This is really an astonishing feat, because to find those examples that will work in all of those different periods really means going out beyond what any one researcher can do in the archives. So I'll evoke one of your vivid examples and then frame the question. Page 138, you're preparing to conclude a very careful discussion of slavery and emancipation. That discussion encompasses rebellions that brought down crushing repression, a continuing unlawful trade in African captives to be enslaved in Cuba, armed struggle under the banner of emancipation that did not initially yield independence, and many daily efforts by those who were enslaved to make do and get by. And to close that discussion, you draw on your mother's memories, which I assume in this case are from the late 1930s, I would guess. Mm-hmm. So you write the following: decades later, and here you mean decades after the 1880s and 1890s, and these are your words, an elderly African-born man named Genaro Lucumi and his wife Irene, both formerly enslaved, sometimes gathered neighborhood children, my mother among them, you say in a parenthetic way, to tell stories. He recounted tales of fighting in Antonio Maceo's independence army. She recalled buying her freedom in the final years of slavery. Even in their Sunday stories, the struggles for freedom from slavery and freedom for Cuba were part of the same epic. End of quote. Now, this is really deeply insightful and absolutely memorable. Your readers will not forget that this was a process of emancipation, not a single political act called abolition of slavery. And of course, for a historian, it evokes the fusion of direct contestation, Genaro's decision to join Maceo, right alongside strategic adaptations, Irene using that fragmentary recognition of fragile property rights for enslaved people during those last years of emancipation to push through the illusion that she was either property or a ward of a master and buy her way out of that status. So here's a hard question. How does a researcher come to discern which stories to track, that is to say, to dig into? Because in the archives, there are thousands of stories. How do you anticipate the ones which, if you dig, may actually have this capacity to illuminate? It strikes me that it's in some ways like a novelist's imagination, but it remains completely anchored to the actual methods of scholarship. Even when you talk about imagined individuals in those last beautiful pages about the sculpture and the head of a woman and what she's thinking in her vida interior, in her interior life, each of those seemingly imagined possibilities is actually anchored, I think, in something you've seen in the archives. So here's what I would just say. I think often historians, when they're writing, or scholars, when they're writing a history, one extreme is to have a really driving master narrative that then goes and picks up some examples along the way, but only to really harness them to the predetermined narrative. We've all read books like that. You find lots of them, particularly in bookstores and airports, right? There's a driving analysis, and then there are nice little anecdotes that trail around. But the other extreme, and you'll recognize this one, is a kind of micro-history that tries to build up a whole mass of detail about people and events that seem to hide underneath familiar narratives, and it doesn't include any bold-faced names. The author then has to try and persuade the reader to stay with it, even though there won't be any Antonio Maceo or Fidel Castro or Barack Obama. That's very hard, and it's sometimes quite unsuccessful. It becomes indistinguishable from a kind of niche genealogical preoccupation. But you found a way to strike the balance. So tell us a little bit about that process, how sitting at your desk in New York or in the archives in Havana or at your mother's bedside in Miami, you knew which stories to tell.
Okay, should I respond now or yeah?
Please, yes, yeah. Please.
I feel like, they're such great questions, and I feel like the most honest answer to both of them would be to say, I don't know, but I'm not going to, from the beginning, but I'm not going to do that. Okay, so in terms of what you were suggesting about empire and the language of, and the discourse and tone of American policymakers, I agree. I get the sense also that 1898 debt of gratitude language is now finally defunct. And I agree that what we've seen, both contemporaneous with that discourse and then since in more recent history, is this this propensity to fall back on a language about control and about the U.S. presumption to dictate and control and say what Cuban future should be. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We hear, every time Marco Rubio opens his mouth, or Bob Menendez, or even Biden, we hear faint or very strong echoes of that kind of language. I do think, as you said, you suggested at the end, whether a narrative like mine might lead policymakers to rethink that. I have no confidence that it will do that. I don't, first there's the question of whether they'll read it. But if nothing else, I do feel like the narrative should make clear, whether to policymakers or just, lay people and voters and readers, that discourse is completely counterproductive. If you know Cuban history deeply, if you know the relationship of Cuba, the long history of Cuba-U.S. Relations, you should understand why that kind of tone and language is so counterproductive, and why something like, I think Lillian Guerra, I heard you say once in one of your interviews that the U.S. should surprise the world with radical friendship by ending the embargo. Radical friendship would be might be a more productive avenue for policy, and I completely agree with that. I would also say, though, that even though I would advocate, of course, such a change in tone and such a change in policy, I think it's important to say that that a change in tone is necessary, but it'll never be sufficient. So you referred to Barack Obama and the change and how his tone very clearly changed. He spoke about Cuba-U.S. relationships very differently than any president before him. And initially, that was received very favorably in Cuba, but then a week after he left, Fidel Castro wrote that essay, Brother Obama, in which he relied on the same tired tropes of U.S. imperialism, in part because they're so easy to resurrect when there's so much truth in them. But and despite Obama's interest in changing the tone, the Cuban state reverted back to its habitual tone about U.S.-Cuba relations. One other thing, though, about the debt of gratitude trope and what, well, it's interesting that while I think it'd be hard for American statesmen to use it now, there is room, and I think they use something that historically preceded the debt of gratitude trope, which was the idea of the U.S. as humanitarian savior. We saw that this summer when during the really bad phase of COVID in Cuba and during the protests, that the language that people were using was a humanitarian intervention, et cetera, that was reminiscent of the lead up to American intervention in 1898. So that's just something to point out. And another thing to point out is that the debt of gratitude trope remains actually really powerful within Cuba, not to talk necessarily about U.S. empire, but to talk about Black Cubans and Afro-Cuban history. So if you go back to the late 19th century and early 20th century, the newly independent state, whenever Black Cubans tried to point out examples of discrimination and to claim their rights, white government leaders would talk about how Black Cubans owed Cuba a debt of gratitude. The independence movement had brought them into history, had given them freedom, and now they had to be grateful and patient. And that's the kind of language that we've seen since 1959, too, for dealing with Afro-Cuban demands for greater rights, et cetera. And we saw it. I was surprised to see it in some of the discourse around the summer protests this year, where so many participants were Black, and where defenders of the state said, why are Blacks protesting? The revolution gave them everything they have. They should be grateful. So it's another kind of debt of gratitude that should also is worth abandoning. I think so. I would say that in answer to your first question. The second question is more about writing and research and writing, and how to recognize a story that will bear good fruit, right? And I think I don't know that I have an easy answer to that, or I can point to like a replicable method necessarily, but I think there's several things. One I think is my history as a reader, that I know what I like to read. I've always read a lot of fiction, in which of course narrative and story and character is hugely important. So I think that just kind of shaped who I later became as a writer. But I think even more important than that is some of my. It's almost like a question of temperament and personal experience. I think, and I've talked about this elsewhere. The fact that I grew up in a community that was predominantly Cuban, that was working class Cuban, where most people, hardly anyone had gone to college, and most people hadn't even gone to high school. Right. And they were working class, they worked in factories and all that. But at the same time, they were also very, avowedly anti-Castro and anti-communist and anti-revolution. I think growing up like that, and then having that experience as background to then reading big narratives about revolution, just always made me see how things didn't fit. It doesn't mean that my purpose was to debunk the revolution. It wasn't that simple. It was more that I just saw that analysis that focused on preset categories that then would determine human behavior just didn't work. My experience showed me that it didn't make sense. If I used those kinds of analysis, I could never make sense of my own life and of my parents' lives. And when I read books like that, I felt like there was never room in them for people like the people I had grown up with. There was never room in them for people like my parents. So I think I was always drawn to telling stories that began with the people rather than with the categories and the structures. So I think the stories allow you to do that. You can build up from stories and create your analysis this way, rather than assume the analysis and then fit the people in. But I think to me, it almost feels like, it's kind of sounds strange, but it's like my default way of seeing the world and seeing history. And then in terms of knowing which stories to focus on, I don't know. It's like you find, you're reading something and it wakes you up, and you think, that could be really interesting. And then you start digging, and sometimes the digging gets you nowhere, or you dig and you find things, but it's not that interesting. And so, but you never know before the fact, if you think about the inauguration of the vice president in Cuba, I remember reading that in a book and just stopped, it was in one of Gerald Horne's books. And I thought, what? And he just said it in passing, and it turns out afterwards, I realized I had read it elsewhere, but I never remembered it, because in those other versions, it was just mentioned in passing to make a bigger point. But the emphasis was the point, not the story. And then once I thought this could be great. An American vice president taking his oath of office in Cuba just illustrates so much, is so evocative. And then, I just began with the story rather than the point. And I think it's actually easier to do, Rebecca, in a book like this, where you're covering 500 years. And so you only have to dig so far to make it interesting. Unlike these amazing microhistories where you have to do so much digging to know how it's going to work and if it's going to work. So I actually think that doing this is easier than the full microhistory.
Great, thank you. Before I turn to Lily for her commentary and questions, let me just encourage you to line up for your interventions. Please don't use the chat. That's something we try to limit to the panelists, and we'll focus on the questions in the Q&A function, as well as those in the raised hand queue. Let me also say, I may have said, Lily, correct me if I'm wrong, that you began researching in Cuba in 1969, when I meant 1996. Just to be very clear, 1996. But with that, apologies for if I misspoke there. And with that, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. Lily, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you. Well, I'll say that 1995 is the first time I went to Cuba. They wouldn't let me do research because they were watching me in Cuba to make sure that I was going to do research. And that was all because of Ferrer. I had no one to advise me as to how to get there, no one to give me advice as to whom to write. Ferrer wrote me a letter of recommendation. She was still a graduate student herself. She told me blow by blow, and this is in longhand, I still have all the letters, what I needed to do. And so my career in many respects owes its origin to Ferrer's intervention and to her splendid example that clearly spoke louder than anything else for me in Cuba. So I'll say that when you were making your comments, Ada, you remarked that no Cuban can will away history. And it's very true that I think Cubans are haunted not just by the history that was, but mostly by the history that might have been. And one of the reasons I like your new book, I love your new book so much, is that for me, it has always been very, very insulting for people to assume that any history is inevitable, but especially when they assume it of this, quote, tiny little island. And I had many years of working at an institution where I was constantly being told, well, we already know what happened in the Soviet Union. We know it's going to happen in Cuba. It's the same thing. And I was always appalled by this, as if the history of a small country was more inevitable than the history of a large country. And in fact, one of the things that makes your book so spectacular is that you see a thread between your early chapters and Freedom's Mirror or Insurgent Cuba, which I have now taught 27 times. I could probably recite it for you. But I teach those two, and I teach Insurgent Cuba in the same way that I will teach this one, precisely because one of the things that you realize is that Cuba might have had a completely different leadership, meaning that it might have had a Black leadership, meaning that when you look at the 19th century, you see so many examples of Black consciousness, big B, forming and creating itself in the most unexpected moments, sometimes the hardest moments. You start one of the great stories of the history that might have been for the 19th century with the story of Aponte. Maybe you could address, I would love you to address why you think that mattered so much. And you have done so much to have people draw their attention back to this sort of forgotten memory as well as contribution. But that thread of the role of Black consciousness and Black leadership in defining freedom, making, not just you say at some point in this book and in other ways in Insurgent Cuba, that Black contributions to the wars for independence were not just meant to free Cuba, but to make their freedom meaningful. And that phrase in itself is something that sticks with people. And as I said, I've taught you so many times that I have seen generations in different places react to that idea that making freedom meaningful, not just making Cuba free, is what propelled these folks who really, had everything at stake, not just their lives, but what could become of their lives, were they to stand back and just be complicit with a system that perhaps then in the 19th century seemed impossible to overthrow. And when you look at, every revolution that Cuba has had in the 20th century, and I will still call the 1933 revolution a revolution. Those of you who are listening who don't like that. Every revolution or every potential revolution that Cuba might have had in the 20th century, which were meant to give Cubans back the history that might have been, the destiny that was stolen, perhaps in 1898 in particular by the United States when they intervened, and the constant interventionism, the rebuilding of the plantation economy, all of the ways in which Cuba goes from being a revolutionary place with all kinds of opportunities for change to being something that those who fought the wars for independence never intended. You know, those potential revolutions of the 20th century and the ones that actually happened, they're all about returning to this stolen destiny in some ways, and they're also about reimagining a future that has yet to be. And this kind of optimism goes hand in hand with the haunting. You know, and I don't think of it as a burden. When I've read people talking about this in their private correspondence, when I've heard it said to me a million times as a child, when I myself have written about it, you know, the history doesn't haunt Cubans. It sort of propels us forward when it's history, precisely, and not amnesia or something that we decide is a simple story. So when I thought about what question I would ask you, I wanted you to speak about Aponte and the various ways, and maybe I see too much, but the various ways in which your illuminations of the 19th century project in various key moments the possibility for Black leadership, for a much more radical version of racial equality and promise of racial equality to assert itself through Black leadership, and whites contributing as whites potentially, but also as people who were willing to really fully embrace notions of racial equality and not simply anti-racism, which isn't the same thing, not the same thing. So I would say, too, the second question that I had has to do with your coverage of, the 1959 revolution. And I love that in many respects, you highlight the role of words. And I myself have argued that the revolution was made by words, convincing people, but also Fidel and the role of history and the actions of the United States and the rapidity with which people behind the scenes were acting all go hand in hand with control over public discourse. So, by the time you get to the May of 1960, the two biggest national newspapers, the far-right newspaper, Diario de la Marina, and Prensa Libre, the progressive left newspaper, were nationalized, taken over on the same day. And then after that, you don't have freedom of the press. So it's just one example. But what I love about your discussion of how the revolution was made with words is you remind us just how many words came out of the mouth of Fidel Castro. And so you say on page 316 that the first speech that he gives on the heels of the revolution's triumph was 12,000 words long, 30 single-spaced pages, and he worked with no notes. Having myself read probably hundreds of pages of Fidel Castro's transcribed speeches that were in the newspapers, both those that were independent prior to the nationalizations and then, Revolución or Granma afterwards, it is sort of just stunning, the saturation and how control over public discourse was so much a product as well as a process in which there is one voice in particular that so constantly intercedes. So then there are these moments in your discussion, and so I think this is chapter 25, where you talk about Fidel arriving in the United States for his visit, and that occurs in April. And very few of us, because we're so overwhelmed by the story, once we know about the story, until we get to your book, and you give us so much more. We know the story, perhaps, of his visit to the United States. We don't know the full story of that. But you precede the discussion of that by telling us that Fidel gave 3 speeches, April 8th, April 9th, April 12th, at which he effectively begins to promote the notion that he doesn't need to have elections anytime soon. Revolution primero, right? Revolution first, elections later. And then, of course, that's what Nixon is pushing. And I actually found it kind of refreshing that when Nixon meets with Fidel, as you describe, he says, he writes, we would prefer 4 years. 4 years is sort of a long time before we get to elections. The whole notion that he would even consider 4 years before they have elections. Cuban people were calling for 10, as you say. People were really willing and compelled to see change happen before it could be lost. So they're in sort of a nutshell. There are all these different paths that Cuba could have taken just in those stories that you tell around Fidel's trip, and it's like 2 pages. So it's wonderful. I mean, this is what I most thoroughly enjoy about the book, is that methodologically you provide us with a window onto these contingencies, but also these alternative Cubas that are there present and that are, potential. So anyway, I'll end with that. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this book. It's a gift. It's a gift.
Well, thank you, Lillian. I just want to say I'm really glad that I did the book. On the one hand, sometimes I thought, a history of Cuba, a history of a country, it can be such a boring kind of flat idea, right? But I knew that it could be different. So, and I'm glad I did it. It was actually really fun to do. I learned enormously. I read, all your work on 59, and it was a challenge, but also really fun to think about how to narrate it. So I just want to preface it with that. So going back to your first question about Black leadership and Aponte, as you know, I mean, that when all my work before this book had more to do with that, right? So the first book on the Cuban independence movement and the participation of enslaved and formerly enslaved people, the book on the impact of the Haitian Revolution and how that transformed Cuban slavery. So in some sense, my whole career as a historian was framed with questions having to do with that, and from having participated at Michigan as part of the post-emancipation project that Rebecca directed with Fred Cooper and Tom Holt. So the question of Black Cuban history, the question of slavery, the question of Black mobilization, and has been critical throughout. And in both my first book and my second book, I dealt explicitly with the question of Black leadership, both the rise of Black leadership and the wars of independence, about imagining Black leadership for enslaved and free people of color in the second book who led conspiracies and rebellions against slavery. So it's a category of analysis or an area of analysis that's really, I think, critical. You said to talk about Aponte specifically. So Aponte was a character that I wrote about a lot in the second book, and I bring him up again in this book because he masterminded a rebellion and conspiracy against slavery at the beginning of the 19th century. And I think he's such an important figure, both for the movement that he tried to put in place, but also for the kind of society that we think he might have envisioned. So for those of you who don't know, he created a book of paintings that was lost. So we have no access to it. We only know what he described in his by virtue of the trial testimony. But he kind of retold, the book is a universal history that he narrates pictorially by placing Black people at the center. So it is a kind of, I think, among the many things it can be, it is a meditation on Black leadership and Black sovereignty. One of the things that's interesting in terms of Aponte's place in Cuban history, because he's a figure that's often invoked and that's well known in Cuban national history, but when his memory is, for a lot of the 20th century, his memory was mobilized as something evil. And so there was a phrase, más malo que Aponte, worse or more evil than Aponte. After the revolution came to power, in revolutionary historiography, he was resurrected as a kind of precursor to independence and to revolution. So here's an example where you have this very rich historical figure, a revolutionary, a thinker, an artist, and he's put in a box that says revolution, that says like, pre-1959 revolutionary, pre-1898 independence advocate. But if you actually read the things that Aponte said in the trial and read his descriptions of his book, the Cuban nation is not a part of that. So, and it's interesting that he's recuperated as this precursor of national revolution, right? Of a struggle for a free Cuba, when he was, at least if we take his words, he's most interested in the end of slavery, and in a society in which there is no slavery and in which black men are leaders. So I think it's important to make that part of the story, right? We can't assume that everything is taking you to Cuban independence and Cuban revolution, right? So I think that's part of the reason that I thought he had to be in here, even though he was already in my second book much more prominently. So, and then your final question, your thoughts on 1959 and the role of words. Yes, that's part of the reason I say that writing the book was so much fun. I mean, it was also painful. Like, I didn't want to read speech after speech of Fidel. I mean, they can be numbing, but trying to, I just read a lot and just try and organize my notes chronologically. So I had like this huge Word document. And as I was reading, I would place the things I found in chronological order. It's a very simple method of taking notes, but it forces you to be in that moment where you don't know what's going to happen, right? And to stay in that moment longer than you would if you're reading the analysis later. So I was mostly reading primary sources and then thinking about them chronologically. So and so doing that overwhelms you, yes, with all the words and the way that one voice is coming to predominate. But also it makes clear how others, as you say, how other things might have been possible. But of course, like hyperfact or counterfactual history is always tricky, right? Because then you think, well, every counterfactual can produce like 10 other counterfactuals, right? So it's not like you can narrate an easy alternative history. All I could do was know in this moment, this might have happened, or this might have happened, or this might have happened, but each one of those would take you somewhere differently. So I couldn't narrate, I couldn't end up with like a simple narrative of something else that might have been, right? So for example, if you're looking at 1959 and the first months of 1959, when you have people resigning because of elections, or because Fidel and Raul are giving too much power to communists, et cetera, when you have people questioning the personalism of his rule, right? People like Urrutia or, any one of them, right? You think, well, could there have been, or even when Fidel himself is talking about a third way and a humanism, right? And trying to resist initially that kind of binary imperative, you think, well, maybe there could have been something that would have been, that wouldn't have ended up making Cuba a communist client state of the Soviet Union, right? Something that would have been that would have hearkened more to 1940 or to the stated objectives of the 26th of July movement, right? Especially the stated objectives of the 26th of July movement. But then, okay, would the U.S. have gone for that, right? That's the other big question. And the answer is because the U.S. is part of the one insisting on this binary imperative, right? So all that to say that yes, that you can think about other alternatives. What happened was not predetermined, but it isn't only one person's actions that determine the outcome, right? That it's Fidel in relation to the U.S., in relation to, all kinds of what the U.S. is doing, what people are doing. So I don't have much more to say other than that. But I'm glad you enjoyed the narration of it anyway.
Thank you, Rebecca and Lily, for two really exceptional comments, and Ada for your response. Lily, your mentioning of Fidel's speeches had me vividly recalling long speeches that I sat through in Havana with him as part of a conference organized by the National Security Archive. It was an eyewitness conference, and so we would go around the table, and everybody would talk for a minute or a couple of minutes, or even if a few minutes, and then it would be an hour and a half of Fidel, and then it would go back to a minute or so of other folks. Anyways, wonderful comments. My question to Ada, as we then go to the audience, is could you talk just for a moment about your source base? We've already touched on archives and documents and where you found some of the stories, but especially about kind of contemporary archival access in Cuba as an issue, given that the Wilson Center is home to the Cold War International History Project. We like to think about those things. I'd love to hear an update from you if you have any, or certainly your own experience in a nutshell. And then we'll go to John Martin. We'll go to John Martin for the next question.
Okay. Yeah, I don't really have an update. I think because the book comes after more than 30 years of working on Cuba. For the earlier period, I relied on a lot of the archival and other work that I'd done before. And then for the contemporary period, I relied mostly on, there's such a voluminous printed primary source base, and also then all the, the Digital National Security Archive and the Wilson Center Cold War History Project, things like that just made it possible to work with archival material, digitally and remotely. And I did a little bit of. There was also some material at the New York Public Library, but I did not go to Cuba to do research on the revolutionary period.
Okay, great. I think Eric has a question. Peter, Rachel, can we bring up John Martin as well? But Eric, slip one in right now.
Thanks so much. So we have the book, and you're giving talks here. How will this go over in Cuba? Who will be able to read it? Will you be able to give talks there? Have you given talks there?
Well, it's a little, because of COVID, it's just too soon to tell. So, so basically, I hope it's read in Cuba. There are some people in Cuba who I've sent copies to. So I know that some people there have it, but it's not like it's for sale there. I'm also hoping that it gets translated in Spanish in multiple countries, including Cuba. I don't know how it will. I don't know how it will be received. So, people there may not like that I don't use Triumph of the Revolution, for instance, as a phrase to talk about 1959, right? There will be issues like that. At the same time, I think there won't be a question that it comes from a place of deep, respect and love for the country. I just don't think the country is synonymous with the government, just like I think no country is synonymous with its government.
Professor Ferrer, it's John Martin. I'm a retired journalist, but I spent the Cuban Missile Crisis as an Army private in basic training, and I'm wondering if there are any special sources that you acquired about the Cuban Missile Crisis that we might not be aware of, and also, is there a different narrative in the book about Fidel and Nikita and how that crisis came about and who wanted it and who didn't want it?
So one of the things there's so much that's been written on the missile crisis, and there's many primary documents available through things like the Digital National Security Archive and the Wilson Cold War Project. So I relied on all of those, and I think on the conference that Christian mentioned, which was the the retrospective kinds of conferences on the missile crisis after US documents were declassified, and then people on different sides of that conflict met to talk about it. So I looked at the records that were made available for that and some of the scholarly work that came out of that conference. What I did try to do though is I began that chapter by focusing on the little rural town where the missiles were first discovered. And I talk about, there's a group of people who are doing archaeological, I can't remember now, maybe in Norway or in Sweden, I don't remember, but they are doing excavations of Cold War sites. And so they've done all this excavation and oral history work in Cuban sites that were, Cuban sites near the missile hangars. So basically, I just tried to, in the same way I started the Bay of Pigs chapter by talking about the landscape and the people who were there, I did the same thing with the missile crisis and talked about the people in this town and what they made of the fact that all of a sudden there were Soviet soldiers and that there was all this secretive stuff going on and planes flying overhead. So, and that I got from reading that more work on that archaeological kind of research.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you have an intervention?
This was actually a little bit angling back to Eric Arneson's question about whether it would be read in Cuba. I think it may be helpful to think about overlapping and concentric circles of dialogue and discussion. There are spaces where colleagues talk. There are things that reach out beyond that. There are talks that are given in the university. Only on certain issues is there a kind of hard line about whether a given thing can be spoken or not. And so it's worth pointing out that Ada and others have worked long and hard to make sure that scholarship being produced in the United States is translated into Spanish and distributed in Cuba. And I'd say for myself, my happiest moment was when someone told me that copies of the Spanish edition of one of my books were available in the bus station for 50 cents a copy. And I thought, well, okay, that means basically who knows who will read it, and that's wonderful. So I think the possibility of circulating written material that's historical is greater than we might imagine, but it requires a tremendous amount of effort. It just is imagine all the difficulties of publishing and then multiply them by no paper and no ink, and imagine them. But it isn't exactly as though we've always had to keep our heads down while in Cuba. We've both participated in events, trained lots of, worked with the training of lots of graduate students. So it's good news that there's more listening and more exchanging than might be imagined in our standard Cold War frames.
Thank you. Very helpful. Let's go next to Myrna Jill, please. Myrna Jill, and then we'll go to John McAuliffe.
Sorry, I didn't realize my hand had been up. Thank you for the book. I plan to take one to my good friend in Havana. He's an English teacher and he is also a historian, so he'll be happy to get the book and to read it. And I'm sure he'd be happy to share his thoughts with you as well if you would like to send me your email address. I've gone many times and I just returned the 22nd of this month. And most everyone, all the young people want to leave. They're unhappy. They don't see a future. Even people who are in their 40s and 50s and never thought about leaving are disappointed, sad, and deflated. I have heard from them that if they believe that if the sanctions and the embargo were done away with, that would provide them with some hope. And they also know it would bring awareness to what their government is not doing. It would take the excuse away from their government. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you so much for this book.
Thank you. Ada, do you want to respond to this or just a comment, I guess?
Yeah. It makes sense. I've heard a lot of the same, obviously, when I'm there about people wanting to leave and frustration and so on. Yeah. So.
Great. Dr. Guerra, did you have a response. You have your hand up.
You're
You need
muted.
to you're muted.
Okay. Mine is just to emphasize in a different way the need for a book like this, in part because it's so elegant that it's hard to get mad. And I'll say, I've had many Cuban students in my classes of all generations. I'm finally to the point where I have students who arrived 5 years ago, arrived 4 years ago. And last week in my doctoral seminar, when we had just finished reading one of your books, the student said, I went to the Lenin School and I have never read the history of either, what was called the Necessary War. And she kept calling it the War of 1895, the Necessary War, of course, because that's what Fidel called it. That's what it's supposed to be called. And if you don't call it that in a classroom setting, you're going to be called out by the teacher. But she also said, speaking of other books that we're also reading in the class, I never knew the history of the Communist Party. And, basically I'm a communist, right? I was a member of the Communist Youth. They don't teach this. What is taught about Cuban history is so very, very narrow. And the history of the Cuban Revolution has been narrowed with every decade that's passed, especially in the last 3 decades when the Cuban state adopted capitalism and still continued to be Communist Party led. The history of the revolution is really narrowed to 1959 to 1962. Yeah. Nobody talks about the 70s. Nobody talks about the 80s. Nobody remembers who Brezhnev is, the 10 million ton harvest. The kind of impact that a translation of this book would have would be phenomenal. It would be similar to Cinco Siglos de Historia, which is Francisco Scarano's, ode to the history of Puerto Rico at a time and to this day when Puerto Rico has never had its own textbook, covering in Spanish, covering Puerto Rican history. And, it's incredible that we have such spectacular island scholars, but the vast majority of them do not work on the 20th century because that gets you in trouble. And almost no one works on the revolution because you can't, because you never know what you can say and what you can't say. And over time that changes. So, this kind of a work that holds nothing back, but is also so brilliantly written and is so anchored in sources, that it becomes just, impossible to just simply dismiss it. It's a wonderful, it would be a wonderful book for Cubans to read. And when I read it, I never saw it as a book that was somehow driven towards an American US based audience. I was reading it from the angle of how would my people on the island read this book? And I think that, that would be an extraordinary contribution to be made to not just knowledge, but to the future of Cuba to have this book available.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for these comments. Yes. Let's go to John McAuliffe. John McAuliffe, if you're still, yes. Okay, if you could please unmute yourself.
Yep. Okay. All right. Let me see if I can get my actual. That's a print that was made in Cienfuegos, a combination of an Irish and Cuban theme, and I'm not sure if I can. Well, there's no reason to put my picture in. Couple of things. One, the book is of course wonderful, and one wonders whether anybody in the State Department or the White House has bothered to reach out to you and suggest that maybe a dinner or coffee would be in order. You must have gone a little nuts, as I have over the last several weeks, with the legitimately righteous language about the independent self-determination of Ukraine from Russia, and wondering whether Blinken and the other people that say that ever bother to apply their words to the US and Cuba in terms of respecting the rights of countries to make their own decisions. But anyway, my question goes to something you said during your presentation, which concerns a lot of us, which is the 700 or so people who were arrested in July. There's precedent with the Bay of Pigs prisoners, with the Black Spring arrestees, even with Alan Gross, for bilateral negotiation to try to solve the problem of legally convicted people and finding political solutions to that. And I'm wondering whether you think, either from the Cuban American community or the US government side or from the Cuban government side, whether once the trials are finished, there might be some discussion that might involve going back to the Obama policy, because the Cubans blame the embargo and blame the Trump, now Biden policies as being one of the causes of the July protests. Do you see any hope of that kind of moving out of the policies, which are now just Trump redux, into a reimagination of U.S.-Cuban relations?
Not really. I mean, I don't know what Biden is going to do, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. I don't think. I mean, Biden has so much on his plate. I really think that Cuba just doesn't. Cuba doesn't matter that much to him, other than in terms of upcoming elections. And then the easiest thing to do in regards to upcoming elections is to hold up the Trump policy. Also, so I just don't see it happening anytime soon. He also never promised to, he never. It's interesting. I think I've said this before. I can't remember, John, if you were there on another one of these, how if you look at the Democratic Party platforms over the last few years, the 2020 platform was the only recent one where overturning the embargo was not part of the stated platform. I just don't think there's that much will to do it.
Yeah. And they've also, basically, if you look at Sullivan or the National Security Advisor's rhetoric November 15th, they've gone back to regime change.
Yeah.
They just put it in it's all in human rights and terminology, but it's basically regime change is what they're demanding. I agree that pessimism is the greatest realism.
Yeah. I think Christian's trying to jump in.
Yeah.
Yes, I think I want to bring in one more question. To switch topics a bit, thank you, John. I want to pose, maybe that will have to be our last, perhaps, we'll see, our last question, or second to last, we'll see. Question by, hold on, let me get it up, sorry for the, by Julio Cesar Aguaj. Hello, Ada, thank you for your work, this fantastic book, and everyone for this space. The book shows a photo of Fitz squaring of a white girl as a symbolic representation of Cuba taken around 1898. You explain how the war in Cuba also served as a space for reconciliation within the United States. However, the Spanish colonial propaganda had underlined the image of Cuba as a black republic. That would be a problem for the United States in the case of Cuba's independence. It would seem that only in the 20th and 21st centuries have we seen image wars because this is an era completely traversed by visual culture. However, there's a great visual confrontation around 1898. Can you tell us a bit more about that war of images between Cuba, Spain, and the United States, and the keys and interests with which it was represented?
Well, I mean, it's a striking photograph of Cuba represented as a young blonde barefoot white girl, and it goes with. I mean, Luke Betis has written a lot about this in a way that about the way the representation of Cubans and of Cuban patriots or Cuban independence fighters changed from the period of 1897-98 till the period to the time that. To the end of the war, right? That in the beginning, Cuba was represented as a damsel in distress, and the U.S. as a hero coming in to save her. After the Americans came in, and after they intervened, and then the representation changed, and there was a much greater focus on Cuba being, Black insurgents, often represented as children. So there were very racist depictions of the Cuban Liberation Army, which harkened back to the way Spain had always represented the rebels. So it did definitely change over time, and the racial representation of Cuba was a major part of that.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that question, and also thank you for the response. Thank you. I think we have to bring this seminar to an end, unfortunately, because there are many more questions in the queue and in the Q&A. But we'll have to. We'd like to bring these things to an end by 5:30. Ada, Rebecca, Lily, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and your engagement and the discussion this afternoon. Thanks to all of our all of you in the audience for your questions. I'll turn it over to Eric for final words. Eric.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. Please join us next Monday at 4 p.m. when the Washington History Seminar returns for our third session of the new year. This one focusing on Klaus Lauris's Uncertain Allies, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Threat of a United Europe, with Carolyn Eisenberg as our discussant. We hope to see you next week. Till then, take care, be safe, and good night. Thank you, everyone.